So, if you recall from a few weeks ago, when I started this series, our first lesson in this series was about the difference between um, Israel's monotheistic culture and the polytheistic cultures that surrounded it. And so we talked about, in fact, the words are still up here on the board. Um, we talked about how in the polytheistic cultures, the pagan cultures, uh, um, the gods produce and create through sexual activity, right? So rather than creating ex nihilo out of nothing, like the God of Scripture, the gods are reflections of man. And we talked about how the various geographies of these cultures would often be reflected up in how they view God. So if the river, like the Nile River, is the prominent feature of your culture, if it's a mountain or whatever, you'd have a river god that that brings abundance, or the mountain god, or whatever it might be. But regardless of what that is, there's gods for everything, and the gods are very human in terms of their actions. They're not moral, and in order to produce anything, they engage in sexual activity. And so we talked about the implications of that being you have sexual activity prior to creation. It's not a created thing with a nature. It is something pre-creation, rooted in the divine. Okay, and so this leads to the immorality and the degeneracy in these cultures that engage in all kinds of, temple prostitution and things like that, who are doing this to replicate what the gods do. This is an act of worship for them. So the ideas of idolatry and immorality are linked together in the pagan cultures. This is what Paul talks about over and over as he's going to Thessalonica or Philippi or Ephesus, or you see this theme over and over of stop worshiping your pagan gods and stop engaging in these practices. The themes of idolatry and immorality are what differentiate Israel's God, Israel's Messiah, from the pagan cultures around them. So that was just a quick recap of last time, and I want to keep building on this idea of ontology versus casuistry when we talk about marriage and family. So just to give, for those of you who weren't here, to give a brief definition of what these two words mean, ontology is the study of what is, okay? Study of being, okay? It's just what is. Casuistry is a legal word. It's a study of how to respond or react to given sets of circumstances or cases. So think of the if-then statement. If this person does this, then I can do that, right? What about if this person does this? So if you've in law school, they'll give you these hypotheticals all the time. They'll constantly be testing you. Well, if this person, breaks the traffic law and he's in the middle of, violating something and the accident occurs, then how much fault does this person bear versus the other guy who was in the right lane but was speeding? How do you apportion blame, right? Who's in the wrong? So casuistry is a bunch of if-then. So the argument I made last time is that often when we talk about marriage, divorce, remarriage, family, all of these things, we tend to talk about it like this, to try to find out who's at fault, who did wrong, who needs to be corrected, and whether the divorce, the remarriage, whatever, if it's legitimate. Okay, it's this person did this, but before that we find out the other person did that, and before that it was because the first person had done this years ago, and we fall into casuistry. And what I've been trying to do, and what we'll continue to do, is to talk about this subject in terms of ontology, beginning with what is marriage, what is family, what are their natures. And so last time, talking about these things do have natures. They're not pre-creation. They are created institutions. They are not the activity of the divine. God does not engage in sexual activity to produce. He creates of himself, ex nihilo. right? And so that's important because if it's a created thing, it has a nature, it has a being, it has a purpose, it has a telos. And we should figure out what that is, right? To determine any other judgments we might make, about marriage, relating to marriage and family. So, in terms of studying the nature, I want to go fill in this, what is the nature of marriage? Well, we're going to start there. And for that, we're going to turn to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And beginning in verse 26 of chapter 1, it says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish in the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Or in the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" What we see in these verses is man is, in a sense, singular, but also plural. Notice the language there. Verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. There's the him and there is the them together. And notice just before that, this singularity and the singular and plural aspect of humanity is rooted in what you see in the verse prior. Then God said, what? "Let me make man in my image." What's that? Us, right? God says, "Let us," plurality, "make man in our likeness, and let them have dominion over," again, man and them, "have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock." So we know the God we worship has both a singular aspect. There is one God, one essence, right, that is shared, but three persons. There is plurality and singularity in God. Man created in God's image also shares this singularity and plurality. The words him and them are interchangeable or exchangeable here in the text. Why is that? Why do we have he, him, and he, them together? Notice, okay, before I answer that, go on to verse 28 that I read there. The blessing falls on them. Also, them is used. The blessing falls on both, the plurality. Okay? The command to be fruitful and to multiply falls on them. Okay? The command that God gives can only be carried out with a them, right? Be fruitful and multiply and have dominion. You need a them to do that. There is no, because man, unlike God, cannot reproduce of himself by himself. Okay? So the command falls on them. Now I'm setting up chapter 2 here when we get the creation of Adam, right? And God says it's complete. We should see right away that if this them aspect that is emphasized in chapter 1, we should see from that something's missing right away. And Adam is going to be left to learn that. God is not going to just tell him, "Hey, something's missing, you need somebody else." He's going to let Adam experience what it means to be an incomplete human. Just to be him, right? He's going to have to feel the need of the them side of it to be complete. So in chapter 1, we have a different, as I'm sure you're well aware, you have a different account of the creation story where different aspects of it are emphasized. Chapter 1 can serve as a kind of what's called a toledot throughout the book of Genesis, you'll have these little breaks in the narrative where a whole chapter is dedicated to say, who the generations are. They'll lay out all the generations, from, say, Seth down to Noah, or from Cain down to, Nimrod. And Abraham. You'll have these what's called Toledots, which gives you the genealogy, and then it'll go into the next story, breaking down all the details. You can look at the Genesis 1 and 2 creation narrative in the same way. Genesis 1 is giving you a Toledot, day 1, day 2, day 3. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Okay? And then Genesis 2, you pause your timeline, your table of contents, if you will, and you zoom in and you look at the narrative. And so in Genesis 2, verses 7 to 8, we get a breakdown of what the creation of man looks like. So verse 7, chapter 2 says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed." So, very familiar passage to us. God creates man from the dust of the earth, breathes life into him, and then places him in a particular location. Not just to roam the earth, but he gives him a land, a piece of property that he is to steward. He is to tend and to keep it. So I think everybody here probably knows this, but just in case you've never heard this before, because it was new to me years ago, the idea that we bring to Genesis is that in Eden there was everything was perfect, so there was no work to do. And then work came as a result of the fall. Well, that's not what the text says, right? Even before the fall, man is given a particular place to cultivate, to steward, a place that is his, and he's given something to do. He's given a purpose, okay, to tend and to keep the garden. So, recall, as I said a few moments ago in chapter 1, man is given now this job, a purpose, but what he's really called to do requires two people, not one. Man, another observation we could make here is that man is himself a sacramental being. Okay? Now, I'm not going so far as to say sacrament as the way we use sacrament. There are two what we call dominical sacraments, right? The Eucharist and baptism. But sacramental as an adjective, okay, it applies to a whole lot of things. A sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible reality or grace, right? That is our definition of a sacrament, even going back to Augustine. A visible outward sign of an invisible spiritual reality or an invisible spiritual grace. Man is sacramental, a sacramental being. We have physical bodies, right? But that's not all that we are. We're not just made of dust. We have outward bodies, manifestations of an inward spiritual reality. Okay? So God makes man as a sacramental being. That distinguishes us from animals, right? Animals are physical, but do not that physical nature of an animal does not reflect or does not manifest an inward spiritual reality, right? So man himself is sacramental, which is why we partake in sacraments, that God gives us sacraments, because it's true to who we are as people. It's true to our nature. It's true to how he created us. God is going, as I just alluded to a moment ago, God's going to allow at this point man to learn through his experience that he is not complete. And I just think this is fascinating, the way God interacts with Adam. And I think it's a picture of how, that when we get to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not a tree that was itself sinful, right? Like, it wouldn't be the case that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was in itself bad and forever would be the case. What is the actual sin that was committed there? Does anybody know? What's the actual sin? Yeah. Yes, right. Let's push that a little further. What's the why? Why does God say not to eat of it? Is it because this is toxic fruit in and of itself? Or is there really knowledge of good and evil there? Right, it's true knowledge of good and evil. But the sin of the garden is, rather than walking with God in the garden and trusting him over time to reveal more and more what his will is for them, what his plan is, growing them, maturing them, Eve specifically, gets tricked into saying, no, this process of learning and walking with God, that's the scenic route by which God is trying to keep knowledge from me. I have the shortcut here. That's what Satan offers, right? The shortcut is right here. God's trying to keep you stupid because he can exercise power over you and take advantage of you. And so Eve is tempted to be like God, to grasp something that she's been told not to eat, right? But back to this point, this walking with God and learning and growing with God as God comes down and fellowships with Adam and Eve in the garden. What does that look like? I think this is a little picture of that, where God is not just giving oracles all day, command, do this, don't do that. He's walking in fellowship and teaching through experience, saying, hey, Adam, I have a job for you. Name all the animals. And through this job, through this tedious, lengthy job of assigning names to all the animals, Adam is going to learn there's something missing, right? I don't have a match like all these other animals do. And it's going to hit home much harder than God just saying, Adam, you need a match. I'm going to create one. Adam's got to feel this need himself and experience it. And so God is leading him towards knowledge of the truth of good and evil through this process. And so Adam is meant to feel the loneliness. And when Adam has felt that, God will respond by filling that need, by creating Eve. God then puts Adam to sleep, as we know, and he creates a woman from the man and from the rib of the man. And I find this most fascinating, that he does not go back to the dust. He does not go back to the clay, fashion another creature, and then breathe life into her. I think it's very telling that the way the woman is created is she's taken from the man. So in a sense here, where does woman come from? Man. But where does man come from? Born of a woman, right? The two are interconnected from the beginning. God doesn't go to some dust over here and create man. Here's an individual, and here is an individual over here I created from dust, and let's see if they find each other. And they're a good match. No, one is created from the other, and the first son, when you get into chapter 4, Cain, comes from the woman, right? And she says, I have got a man with the Lord, or like the Lord. I have produced a man just like God produced a man, okay? So there is this interconnection between male and female in, again, their ontology, their very being, okay? They are made for each other. Man, I'll hold off on that point. So, woman comes from man, man comes from woman. They're interconnected. Now, Adam wakes, if you know the story, he wakes up, and what is the first thing he does when he sees Eve? Everybody remember verse 23, chapter 2. He writes a little song. Okay, you have the first poem there in Scripture where he writes this song saying, verse 23 of chapter 2, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now, some interpreters of this verse take this as covenantal language. That what Adam is essentially doing here is entering into a covenant with Eve. Saying, in these words, he's accepting responsibility, and he is taking her to be his wife, kind of like a marriage vow. And so if you spin this out a little further, the implications of this idea, Adam and Eve are married because Adam has entered into a covenant with the woman in this language. Now, personally, there's a lot of good people that hold this view. One of them happens to be the presiding bishop of the REC. Okay, so this is not like, heresy or anything like that. However, I think this is a bit problematic to see this as covenant. Sometimes covenant, there's this rush to see covenant everywhere in Scripture. So you take the basic design of covenant and you start saying, oh, covenant, 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 and seeing all relationships based on this covenant, as if they've made a covenant together, so there's a relationship because they've entered into a covenant. So why do I see this as problematic in this case? If we do introduce covenant here, some of this can go, as I've just alluded to. One of the problems is trying to see covenant everywhere, and you start getting away from ontology and start moving towards, for lack of a better word, voluntarism, right? So voluntarism, the act of the will, right? So if it's a covenant, marriage is created by the act of the will. The promise being made, rather than being grounded in what they were created to be. Okay? So here's one of the issues I have. Adam, like I said, Adam is not created from the dust, and Eve created from the dust over here, and that they are, first of all, primarily individuals who find each other. Okay? They are actually made for each other. They do not happen to find each other existing as sovereign entities. One comes from the other. Okay? Also, what if God, brings Eve to Adam and he wakes up? Can you imagine if Adam doesn't say this, and says, not really attracted, God, no thanks, try again, right? That's never going to happen, right? Because God has created her specifically from him and for him, right? Yeah. How it is. It's true. That's a good critique, and we could extend that even further into Israel, and say, God is telling Israel the way it's going to be at Sinai with the Mosaic covenant, right? It's not like, but at the same time, they do have to ratify the covenant, right? That they have to, this is what Deuteronomy is about. Remember what you said back in the wilderness, right? Recalling God did this for you, and you said you were going to keep this law, and you're going to be held accountable to this. So yes, I would say, yeah, that's fair. A covenant of, say, I think we could I don't like dividing out covenant of works versus covenant of grace with everything, the way it's so neatly torn apart. But with Abraham, if we're going to use that language, it is a covenant of grace, right? And that's what Paul refers to back in Romans, right? That before you have the covenant of Moses with Mosaic law, right? That came 430 years after Abraham, which is totally by grace, where he chose Abraham out from among the pagans, and there was nothing he had conditioned. Remember, in continuing on that, Abraham in Genesis 15, the God walks through all the pieces, right? Abraham does nothing, right? So I think, yes, we could distinguish further, and that's helpful in terms of covenants of grace versus covenants of works, where there are two parties coming together. Now, if we use that language, what is the Adam and Eve covenant? Is it a covenant, would we say, of grace, or would it fall into this covenant of works, where Adam has agreed to do his part, and Eve would agree to do her part, right? And if they don't do their part, and neither of them did, right? Because Eve ate the fruit, and then Adam failed to protect her from that. And even when God confronts them, Adam fails to step up and take responsibility. He says, it's the woman you gave me, right? So both of them failed each other. And this is a point I actually was going to make later. I'll just introduce it now. On that basis, if we set up the covenant that way, as if they're both supposed to do their part, both of them failed. That means, as part of the fall, they each have the right to be what? Well, I was not going to go so far as destroyed, but divorce, the other D word, right? And actually, and to be fair, I'm not adding that, and this is not about Bishop Sutton necessarily trying to make about Bishop Sutton, but Bishop Sutton actually says that. It says that once they sin, they have each violated the covenant, and therefore that marriage has to be recreated after the fall, because that original marriage is broken and they're divorced, and God puts that. So if you set it up as a covenant, one of the problems is once that covenant is broken, either side has right to divorce. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure we've broken our covenant in some way, or marriage covenant, pretty much every single day of our lives, right? I mean, in thought, word, or deed, okay? So how far are we going to go in saying that if we go down the covenant road and say covenants require faithfulness and the breaking of the covenant leads to, that's where I'm going with this. I wasn't going to go there quite yet, but yes. Go.
Sounds almost to me like saying, well, you have a broken bone in your leg. Are we going to reset it and let it heal? Or are we going to take the bone completely out and replace it with another one? Which kind of sounds unnecessary.
Right, it does. So, yeah. Right. God is.
Going to uphold it himself.
Right. Right.
And speaking of marriage, like the people that do often talk about it as a covenant, a lot of time they bring in Trinitarian language where it's not a covenant
Right.
simply between a man and woman, but
Right.
it's man and woman and God.
Right.
So you still have a third party so if there is a break on part of the wife or the husband and wife, there's still a third party there that's integrated into it. So it's not as simple as, well, one person broke it, therefore it divides it. You have a third party.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at it in terms of the Abrahamic side of it, where God makes sure that covenants do what they're intended to do, then there's there's an impossibility of failure. Obviously, that's not here, but that is inherent, I think, in the idea of biblical covenant throughout, that God's always there, and he's always the one that carries it through to completion, regardless of the other party's failures.
Okay, so I'm perfectly on board with that framing and language. What I would add then is God is the third party covenant keeper in a marriage. Why? Because, and this is where I would say God, if we want to frame it that way in terms of covenant, it is such because of what God created marriage to be. Right? So it's because of the nature of marriage itself is a union created by God that he can function as that third party in the covenant, the way you're talking about relating it to Abraham. Okay? So I'm not trying to get what I'm trying to do is not to eliminate the idea of covenant. It's simply to be careful in how we're reading covenant into passages like this, where we're reading, okay, let's go forward into the text and look at comparisons of covenants between, uh, if you've ever heard the suzerain treaty, with in the ancient Near East, you had these suzerain treaties where you had emperors that would come around and conquer and enter into covenants with with the kings or nobles of the various lands, saying, if you serve me, it'll go well for you. If you stop paying your tribute and you go off to someone else, I'm going to come in here and exercise my rights over you as a suzerain. And there's a lot of research that has been done on this idea that a lot of features of biblical covenants borrow from the suzerain covenants in the secular world at that time in the ancient Near East. And that's all well and good. The only critique I'm making here is to simply go to the suzerain treaty and try to read everything into it back into Genesis 1 and 2. And it leaves out the nature of things, and you're making all of your interpretations based on the suzerain covenant idea, and if the covenant's broken, well then Adam and Eve after the fall got divorced, and then God reformed them in a new kind of marriage after the fall. Did you have yeah? So I'm not opposed to the way Steve was just defining, covenant and seeing parallels there, but I do, to your point, tend to read this as, yes, an ontological statement where he's saying, what you are, bone of my bones, you are flesh of my flesh, you shall be called woman, not because I like the name, woman, and I came up with it, it's catchy, but because you are taken of what you are, you're taken out of man. So that's what I'm trying to emphasize. Yes, it's a description of being, rather than I'm taking you as my flesh, I'm taking you as my bone, and I'm naming you woman because now I'm committing to you. Right. So it's because of what you are. Right. Because God has taken you from me and for me. He's made you from me and for me to complete me, because I have come to the realization that I'm alone and I can't fulfill what God has called me to do, to go forth, multiply, take dominion of the earth without you. Okay. So, yes, exactly. That's what I'm pushing on here. What's that? All right. So moving on from that, verse 24 then of chapter 2, we see, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So we see that therefore added to this what I see as an ontological statement, because of what is, therefore, the following. And what we see in the therefore is quite interesting. Man will leave his father and mother, and they shall become one flesh. Here again, we see this singularity and plurality of God reflected in the union of man and woman. So they are both two, right? And they're one, right? Ontologically so. They are one and two at the same time. Singular and plural, just as God is one and three. Yes?
On behalf of Josh, who's not with us right now, verse 24 and 25 seems like that narrative kind of input, where he's going from telling the story to just being like, oh, by the way, here's an additional note on why.
You're speaking of the writer later, right? Yes, adding in an editorial comment. Yes. Right. Exactly. Yes. Right. Good catch there. Yes. So this is, somebody obviously coming in later, interjecting a comment, right? And to say why, to explain why this is relevant, right? All right. So you have the two-ness and the oneness, reflecting God's image, okay? And that's the thing. Sometimes we talk about the image of God, and that's really big. I I think over the past 10, 20 years or so, Imago Dei or an image of God idea is there's a lot smuggled in with that concept over the last decade or two. A lot of progressives push on that, okay? And you say, well, and hijack that term. I'm made in the image of God, and God made me this way, right? I'm made in the image of God, so that means whatever is true, being true to myself is what's right. And so image of God language sounds so dignified and sounds so orthodox, but it smuggles in a whole lot of garbage as of late. You know, it's the get out of the argument card. Made in the image of God, therefore human dignity, therefore I've got to be true to myself, all of that. But the image of God here is not just you inside yourself. The image of God is most fully reflected how? In the plural, where you have the plurality and the singularity, right? And so the image of God is not just, oh, God created man in his own image. That was at that moment back in verses 7 and 8. But the image of God is more fully and continually being reflected in the union of man and wife who are fulfilling their calling to go forth, multiply, take dominion, and all of that. The image of God is becoming, you get a fuller and fuller picture of what that image looks like. All right? The other point here in verses 24 and 25 is it's the man who leaves. The man leaves and cleaves to his wife. Now you would think, just based on how we culturally operate, right? This is backwards. The wife leaves, right, and joins the man. She takes his name and joins his household, his family, right? This seems, why is it that it seems a little backward. Why is it the man who is leaving to go to the wife? And what I would argue is that even in this creation account, again, before the fall, we have typology pointing to redemption. That I think this is an argument where God is not, just talking creation language, and then there's the fall, and then he has to shift gears and talk about redemption. I would argue redemption is God's focus even from creation. And so here we see a picture of redemption. It's the man who leaves his father and mother. What does Jesus Christ do? Leaves his father, right? He's the one who leaves. He comes down to earth. He is born of a virgin. And to do what? Why does he leave? To get a bride. He leaves his father to get a bride, the church. And I think that is also what this is pointing to. The man leaving his father and his mother, holding fast to his wife, to his bride, as Christ does, and they become one flesh, which further reflects on the nature of Christ and his church. They are one flesh, which is really powerful to think about. That it's not Christ and his church, but that in the church is one with Christ. One with God. One body. Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Yep. Well, you can see this borne out in story after story. So, for example, if you go to Genesis 24, I think it's Genesis 24, it's the longest chapter in Genesis, longest story. Genesis 24 is about getting Isaac a wife, where the servant is sent out to go get a wife for the son of promise, right? More typology there of we need a wife for the son of promise. We need a wife, the bride, the church, the wife of Christ, right? You can see this with Moses. Moses is calling in Exodus. Go, I hear my people, go bring my wife out of the land of Egypt, is what's going on there. And so we can see this in story after story, this typology that begins all the way back in creation, ontology, right, of the nature of things, right? God sends his son to get the church. Adam likewise, not that he has a father and mother, but the writer here is commenting, what Adam and Eve do is the paradigm for what follows. The husband leaves father and mother and goes, seeks a bride, Christ being the ultimate fulfillment of that. And as Paul, this is why Paul can connect those two things. He can connect nature with God's plan of redemption in Ephesians 5, right? Ephesians 4 and 5, where he's talking about the relationship between husband and wife. That he says this is the greater mystery, right? Is the relationship of Christ and his church. That's why he can connect it back to. Is this a natural thing? Ontological? Yes. Is this also pointing to a redemptive mystery that's going to be revealed later? Yes. Both are true. Okay? All right. So, and then this is where I wanted to close, because of Steve's question, we've kind of touched on it already, which is Adam fails to get out in front of the serpent and is not leading. It is the serpent going to the wife, and she is deceived. And Adam also fails to take accountability when confronted by God. He and his wife, what do? They run and hide. They try to clothe themselves with leaves, and they run and hide. And when God finds them, he goes to Adam first, and what does Adam do? Quickly passes the buck and implies that the problem is with God. It's the woman you have given me that is the problem. She fell for it. I was busy, and she fell for it, and shifts the blame to the woman. The woman does the same thing, of course, shifting it to the serpent. So he's failed her twice. But because marriage is marriage, because man is man by creation, because woman is woman, they do not cease, because of the fall, to stop being man. Man does not stop being man after the fall and create and turn into some kind of new creature. Woman, back to the documentary, What is a Woman? That definition does not change because of the fall. Marriage, what is marriage? That definition does not change because of the fall. Right? It is an ontological reality. So what do we draw from this? Sin corrupts nature. Absolutely. Sin corrupts Adam and Eve's nature. But it does not change their nature. Okay? Sin does not change what a man is or what a woman is. They remain man and woman just in a corrupted form. And just as they are redeemed later, okay? As humans are redeemed by grace. Grace, likewise, does not change what a man is, or what a woman is, or what marriage is. It redeems nature just as sin corrupts nature. It does not replace or change our definition of these things. So we don't have created marriage versus fallen marriage versus redeemed marriage or Christian marriage. Marriage is marriage for everybody. Okay? And this is one of the dangers, sometimes we approach culture in this way that, well, Christians, this is the rule for Christians, but we can't expect non-believers to have the same definition of marriage, right? Yeah, we can, because marriage is marriage. Doesn't matter if you are not redeemed, you're redeemed, you are apart from grace, you have received grace. This is an ontological reality, right? Yes. Imago Dei, yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's the idea that, well, God, made it this way, and it's because of the fall that, we have to live this way. That's right. God's creation of marriage is not faulty, and the definition does not change because of the fall. All right. So, yes. And so again, we wouldn't say necessarily that marriage is a sacrament in the same way that communion is or that baptism is, right? Because we all need, the dominical sacraments are commands of Christ explicitly that are needed for everyone, right? They're not optional. Marriage is a good thing, but are you less Christian if you stay single? No, right? So it is sacramental in the way that I defined that earlier. And man is a physical being that is a visible physical being that manifests an invisible spiritual reality. Marriage is the same, right? Marriage is a covenant in the sense that two people are making vows to each other, but the marriage does not hang together based on the vows alone. Yeah?
So, I know in the Book of Common Prayer it has like 5 lesser sacraments,
Yes.
I guess, and one of those is marriage. So, if what you're saying is that marriage doesn't make you less Christian, but it's still sacramental, in the Roman Catholic Church, if they do elevate marriage to a holy dominical sacrament, but their priesthood is unmarried, how
Yep.
is their priesthood not less Christian?
Because they have 7. Oh, that one doesn't work. Because they have 7 sacraments, and so you start with let's take it through a person's life. What would be the first sacrament someone experiences? So baptism, and then what? Traditionally, what did you say?
I don't know what they call it, like
Confirmation, right? Confirmation. That's a tough question. So traditionally, you didn't partake in communion until you were confirmed. This is why they have, if you know have any Catholic friends, they go to First Communion. They're 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. They have First Communion. It's a big deal. Okay? So traditionally, children did not partake in communion until they were confirmed. Now, in the Eastern Church, I'm not a scholar by any means on the Eastern Church. I've heard that in the Eastern Church, they communed infants before confirmation. That's confirm them at their baptism. Okay, and so you have pedo communion in the Eastern Church, not traditionally in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so that's a complicated question. We practice pedo communion here at the discretion of parents for all baptized, even if not confirmed. Okay. But yeah, traditionally confirmation would be second, and then what? Somebody said it already. Communion, right? The Eucharist. So communion. Okay. So far, everybody's doing the same thing. Now, as you grow into adulthood, you have 2 ways you can go. You can go towards holy orders. That's where you become go into ministry as a priest, right? What's that? Right. You're choosing holy orders, right? Going by Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, I wish, all of you were single. You could be more useful to me, and more helpful, right? So you abandon that. You kind of forswear taking a wife, and that is your vocation, right? Holy order, that is what you're called to. Or you can go the other way, which is sacred marriage. It's one or the other.
It's interesting that in the Orthodox Church, and you have, say, Ticons right up
Yeah.
that the men can get married and
Yes.
remain priests.
Yes. Can't be a bishop, though, but
They cannot be a bishop.
yep.
So what you have is, as soon as these guys are graduating, they're also getting married.
Well, I thought they got married before they were before they were made a priest.
So both of these are, now I'm going to say something very positive. This is what I do like about the Catholic system. I don't believe this is a biblical requirement, obviously, for priests, okay? But what I do like is this idea of vocation, and I think we should recover some of this in Protestantism, and that is, if you're not doing this, it's because you're doing that. So, exactly. Right? So, I hear this, or I've heard this, the idea that I have the gift of singleness. Well, that's not the gift. The gift is chastity, not singleness. I have the gift of singleness, so I'm going to use my gift of singleness and focus on a career rather than family. Okay? That's not the two options in the church. Okay? Without, what I would like to do is modify in terms of continuing to reform, Catholics and Protestants and continuing reform, say, yeah, let's stick with this system, this dichotomy, that's fine, but you can't elevate this to a requirement for ministry, biblically speaking. But I do like these two options, that in the normal course of things, you get married. That is normal. That is what God designed. Or, if you don't do that, it's because you have devoted your life to the ministry in the church. Whether that's as an ordained minister of some kind, or even lay orders. So, this is where you have nuns, for example, or various monks who might not be, a pastor preaching, but they have given their life to the service of the church. They're not saying, well, I don't want family and I just want to pursue my own career, my own life, my own fulfillment. It's either no, you're meant to take a wife and have children, right? That's another thing in Catholic circle. We also, Catholic and Protestant, traditionally Catholics, when you get married, you have children, right? You have to, right? Protestants, it's like, yeah, that's another alternative lifestyle on the board, right? We can have children, we can marry or not, and there's just, it's all up for grabs. What kind, do you want to be single life, casually dating life, focus on your career, or do you want to actually commit to marriage but no family, just the dog, and a couple of no, there's this, you're giving yourself to someone, caring for someone in marriage, or you're giving yourself to caring for the flock, the body, serving God, right? So, this goes back to Tad's question, if this is a sacrament, what are they saying about holy orders? Well, they're both sacraments, and they're the two choices. Okay, you're either going to one or the other. And then, of course, that's 1, 2, 3, 5. Then you have last rites and, what am I missing? Confession. Confession, absolution. Confession, absolution, and last rites, or prayers for the dead, or anointing. All of those names fall under the number 7. So, anyway, that's they elevate. Now, what we would say is these two are the only ones commanded by Christ. Right, with the classical Protestants, these are the only two that are required for everybody. Okay, there's nothing in the Bible saying you must receive last rites. Right? Oh, sorry. No, here we go. Sorry, I just assumed those were at the top. Here we go. There we go. Yeah, no, not confirmation. These are all good. Now, Luther and the classical Protestants did not deny these. Now, I mean, I know. The short version of history is that Luther says we don't need any of this other stuff. And he did write in a defense of communion and baptism as the only two sacraments that Christ commanded. He did, and Calvin and others followed. But that is not because they thought these other things were bad ideas. Right? Luther very strongly held to both confirmation and confession. And when I say confession, I'm not just talking about public confession. I'm talking about auricular private confession and absolution. So he held to those things. He's saying there's nothing wrong with those things. He thought they were great ideas that you should do. But you can't, what it comes back to is, what is it that the church has the power, given the keys that they hold, what is it that they can do based on Scripture and exercise authority and discipline? That's really what it comes back to. Is that there might be a lot of ways to do different things, but what is it that the church can legitimately hold over your head and say, this is Scripture, on this basis we can bind and loose? Baptism and communion, right? So that's really the question. These other things does not make them bad, but what we would say is they are lesser. They have a sacramental, back to what Pastor Garrison was saying, marriage is sacramental, right? There's a sacramental element because the vows are the physical manifestation of something going on here, but that bond is not held together by the vows alone. As if one side breaks the vow, then it's broken, therefore divorce, right? Why? Because marriage is held together, back to what Steve was saying, is there's that third party there. What marriage is what it is ontologically. And it's a union created that is not broken by one person breaking a vow, right? It's sacramental in that sense. All right, that's all I have today. Next week, what I want to do is start getting into the fun passages, like Matthew 19 and Jesus dealing with what marriage is and divorce, and want to build on these first two classes we've talked about, because this is Jesus' methodology. Jesus is not going to be interested, we're going to see, in wrangling about who did what, right, when confronted. He's going to go back to ontology. Well, haven't you heard in the beginning it was this, right? So we're going to wrestle with those, with how Jesus handles marriage as an ontological reality. Evan, could you close in prayer for us? Lord be with you. And with your spirit.